Hi, friends. I'm retired pastor, teacher, theologian Papa Dale, and today's Bible lesson is Intelligent Design and Information Technology. Oh gosh, I know that sounds really boring, but it's very important stuff, so pay attention. Now, I've been serving Christ and studying the Bible for over 50 years. You can see more about me in a video on this playlist titled Papa Dale Intro. 1 John 2:15 says, "Love not the world." Christ versus culture. This playlist is a list that explores the teaching and implications of that. Listen to this lesson or any Bible teacher with caution. Why? Because 1 John 4:1 says, "Dear friends, do not believe everyone who claims to speak by the Spirit. There are many false prophets in the world." And I will also add to that, there are many false teachers. They're rising up en masse in these end times. They cherry pick verses and they take them out of context, and they proof text verses and they take them out of context to support their favorite but false doctrine. So be cautious. Every teacher will sound believable, but they must be consistent and congruent with the teaching of the entire Bible, or the teaching is false. So let's get into it today. What is intelligent design? What is information technology? Well, let's start off by asking the question, what is DNA? One of the major discoveries of the 20th century in biology was the discovery of the structure of the DNA molecule, or the elucidation of the structure of the DNA molecule. That occurred in 1953, when Watson and Crick determined that DNA had a double helix structure along the inside of which were 4 chemical subunits called bases, or nucleotide bases. We now identify them as adenine A, thymine T, guanine G, and cytosine C. Okay, so what we have here is a construct that is the basis of the formation of human cells, human genes. And that construct you can visualize in the form of a ladder with 2 sides and then with steps going across. And that's the double helix of DNA. And the nucleotide bases that I just talked about are proteins. And those are the construction bricks for humanity. They decide what your body will look like. Now, 4 years later, Crick took that discovery one step further and realized that those chemical subunits on the inside of the molecule were functioning just like alphabetic characters in a written language, or digital characters like the zeros and ones we use in software. In other words, it wasn't the chemical structure of those subunits or their molecular weight or their shape that mattered. What mattered was their arrangement in order with an independent code that was later discovered and called the genetic code. And so you've got these 4 units, these 4 subunits of DNA, A, T, G, and C, to reference them for short. A, T, G, and C. And how many combinations of A, T, G, and C can you get? I mean, you might get A, T, G, C, or you might get A, T, 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 G, C, C, C. There are billions and billions of combinations of how these proteins can be ordered within the human cell. And how they're ordered determines everything about the physiology of a human being. So, inside the DNA molecule, what we have is literally information or instructions inscribed digitally or alphabetically or typographically in a way that provides the information that's necessary to build all of the important proteins and protein machines that keep all cells alive. So, here's the thing. Well, I won't go on to that. I won't describe that any further. This is very complex stuff. But this is what goes on inside the human cell all the time. So this is the discovery of this is actually a stop the press moment in the history of biology. People have wondered for centuries, why does like beget like? At least in the case of why we get new proteins that are like the old proteins, the answer is the DNA contains the information for building them, and that's what keeps living cells alive. So, do we observe similar digital information anywhere? We have a lot of great tech companies like Microsoft that writes code in the form of software. The Boeing Company and other companies also use a technology known as computer-assisted design and manufacture. The abbreviation is CAD, C-A-D. That's a technology where information in a digital form is used to direct the construction of mechanical parts or physical systems. So, if you're a Boeing engineer, you might sit at a console and you might write code. That code will go down a wire, it'll be transmitted into another machine code that can be read at a manufacturing arm or center, and then that information will be used to take rivets and put them on the airplane wing at just the right place. So you have a digital information system directing the construction of a mechanical system, and that's what's happening inside you and every human being. You have a digital system that is directing the construction of your body. Now, something very much like that is going on inside the human cell, where the information inside of DNA is being used to direct the construction of the proteins and protein machines that are necessary for all cellular life. You see, the cell is a very complex biological entity. It used to be, back in the days of Darwin, scientists just thought that the cell was just a cell wall that was filled with kind of a jelly-like protoplasm. But we found out that inside this cellular wall is actually activity going on that could be described as machines producing proteins and interacting with one another. They're little tiny infinitesimal biological machines. Now, can evolution explain the DNA code? Natural selection and random mutation don't seem to be a very good explanation for the origins of new genetic information. And the reason for that can be understood by reference to our own experience with digital code and software. If you're a computer programmer, you know that. If you start randomly changing the sections of functional code, you're going to degrade that code long before you ever come up with a new program or operating system. Now, the same thing happens in the biological case because the information in DNA is essentially digital or typographic, and because there are far more ways to arrange those ACGT factors along the DNA molecule that will result in gibberish rather than will result in functional information capable of building a new protein. So inevitably, as random changes accumulate, they're going to find these non-functional combinations, and the process of natural selection is going to have nothing to select. The whole process is going to break down. It's going to degrade. Remember, in natural selection, you can only select for functional advantage. If the code is degraded by random mutations before you ever get to something new and functional, then the evolutionary process is going to terminate. The cell is just going to die. So the natural selection, random mutation process is very good for preserving existing functions in their existing form. It can preserve slight variations on that form, like, for example, different breeds of dogs, but it's still the creation of different breeds of dogs is still happening within the parameters of the dog kind, but it can't generate anything fundamentally new. And that's why you have a lot of evolutionary biologists themselves today saying things like random selection and random mutation can explain the survival, but not the arrival of the fittest. They explain the small-scale variations or changes, but they do not explain where major innovation comes from in the history of life. Why? Because mutations tend to degrade the genome. The reason that random changes inevitably degrade the information in a DNA sequence is the same reason that random changes inevitably degrade information in a section of computer code or English text. All are dependently integrated. You can't just have Shakespeare and take out all of the T's and replace them with Z's, and take out all of the A's and replace them with Q's. It's going to create a mess. It's no longer going to be Shakespeare. If you select 12 letters in the English language that conveys a meaning, there are 100 trillion other possible ways of arranging those same characters that don't convey meaning. Let me read that again. You gotta think of this. Wrap your mind around this. 12 letters is all. If you select 12 letters in the English language that conveys a meaning, you write a little sentence of 12 letters, and there are 100 trillion other possible ways of arranging those same letters. That's just the mathematics of it. The same thing turns out to be true in the DNA protein. For a modest protein of, say, about 150 amino acids long, for every sequence that produces a functional protein, there are about 10 to the 77th other possibilities that don't. That's a huge number, 10 to the 77th. What that means is there is a huge search space that has to be searched by the random mutation mechanism to try to find the functional sequences in that vast array of possibilities. It turns out when you do the math, there isn't even enough time, assuming a 4 billion year history of life on this planet, to have enough replication events, to have enough copying events to search that space effectively. Evolutionists want to say, well, it's because of the vastness of time that made evolution possible. Well, what DNA proves is that there isn't enough time because there are so many random options for the way that the DNA proteins can construct themselves. There just isn't enough time to sort through them to create anything that has meaning. The bottom line is, the neo-Darwinian mechanism is just not a plausible mechanism for generating new functional biological information. Now, what we can explain, the origin of genetic information, Excuse me, I read that wrong. What can explain the origin of genetic information then? As it becomes clear that the various evolutionary mechanisms do not account for the origin of genetic information, naturally people wonder what might. Scientists have proposed an alternative explanation that is the idea of intelligent design. The reason that intelligent design provides a good scientific explanation for the origin of the new information necessary to build proteins and new forms of animal life is that we know from our experience that information always arises from an intelligent source. Always. Whether we're looking at a hieroglyphic inscription, or a paragraph in a book, or information in a section of software code, or even information embedded in radio signals. Wherever we see information and we trace it back to its source, it always comes to a mind, not to an undirected material process. So, the discovery of information at the foundation of life and the discovery that big infusions of information are necessary to explain the origin of new life forms, this suggests the activity of a designing intelligence in the history of life. Well, what is the intelligent design theory? The inference to intelligent design is based on our uniform and repeated experience of cause and effect, which is the basis of all scientific reason. We know from experience not only that the neo-Darwinian mechanism and other similar, more recent evolutionary mechanisms that have been proposed have failed to generate the digital and functionally specified information necessary to build new proteins and new forms of animal life. We also know that there is a cause, and we already know it. A cause that does generate the digital code or digital information. That cause is intelligence. We see it everywhere in our human experience. We have experience of that in our own realm of software technology or our human experience. In fact, Bill Gates has said that the DNA is like a software program, only much more complicated than any we've ever created. What we know from experience is that it takes a programmer to make a computer program. In fact, more generally, we know that whenever we see information, whether it's a software program or a hieroglyphic inscription or a paragraph in a book, whenever we see information and we trace it back to its source, we always come to a mind, not a material process. So, the discovery of information is at the foundation of life in every living cell, in every living organism, and the evidence of big infusions of new information coming into the biosphere, into the fossil record, both suggest that a designing intelligence has played a role in the construction of the information necessary to life throughout the history of life. Therefore, the inference to intelligent design is not just an argument from ignorance. We are not just saying that natural selection and random mutation can't generate new information, or that various chemical evolutionary processes have failed to explain the origin of information. We're also saying we know of a cause that does produce information. That cause is mind. And therefore, based on that positive knowledge of cause and effect, we can infer intelligent design as the best explanation. Now, in fact, it's the only known cause for the generation of functional information. especially in a digital or in an alphabetic form. One of the great information scientists in the 20th century said the creation of new information is habitually associated with conscious activity. That's what we know. Therefore, the inference to design is a really strong inference based on what we know, both about the facts of biology and about what it takes to generate information. Why do so many scientists have an issue with intelligent design? Well, a lot of scientists, because of the influence of materialism, are in a way inured to the reality of their own minds and therefore of minds in general. They've been desensitized to it. There's a kind of computer simulation known as a genetic algorithm where evolutionary scientists tried to show how the mutation selection mechanism would work in a computational environment. They write a little program. They try to get something that simulates mutation and selection to generate a particular sequence of characters or a phrase from Shakespeare. But in order to get the computer to generate the sequence, they had to first give the computer the sequence and then write the program in such a way that as different randomized crops of letter strings are generated, the program selects the ones that are closest to the future function that they want. None of the original strings have any linguistic function at all. They don't have any meaning, but the program selects the ones that are closest to the future function that's desired. So they select for proximity to future function, not actual function. And what that means is that game is rigged. They're trying to prove the absence of initial originating intelligence as necessary to develop new information, yet they create a program based on their own intelligence to do so. They disprove their own theory. So, let's see, where was I? Now that's problematic because natural selection selects for functional advantage. It doesn't have the foresight to tell you what might eventually result in some future function. So what the program generates is not actually analogous to what's going on in biology at all, or how the natural selection mechanism must work. It's like assembling a jigsaw puzzle and using the photo on the box as a guide. That's not a replication of random selection. But notice also the extent to which it does work is entirely a function of the programmer's own mind, his own intellect. He gave the program the target sequence. He programmed the computer select for proximity to future function. So these genetic algorithms invariably end up illustrating the need for the mind to generate information. They've disproven their own theory. Now, a similar thing happens with what are known as ribosome engineering experiments. There, chemists attempt to generate RNA molecules that are capable of copying themselves and thus could conceivably get something like natural selection going because there would be an element of self-replication. The problem is, as the RNA chemists and the ribosome engineers have done their work, they've had to sequence the RNA molecules in a very specific way to get any copying capability out of them at all. As it turns out, they've only been able to generate RNA molecules that can copy about 10% of themselves. But even that limited self-replication capability is the product of intelligence, because it was the intelligent agent who essentially determined the informational sequence that the RNA molecule or the RNA ribosome has, the nucleotide base by nucleotide base. So again, what's being simulated? It appears to me that what's being simulated is the need for intelligence to generate information. So far from the idea that the connection between intelligence and information is only a kind of common sense thing that has no scientific basis, we actually see that the attempt to simulate evolution is providing additional scientific evidence for that connection to intelligence. Well, then why do some scientists reject intelligent design theory? A lot of people reject the idea of intelligent design because they think if you invoke the activity of a mind, you're invoking some unintelligible entity of which we have no real knowledge, or an entity, the conscious mind, which is not material. But in fact, I want to argue that we know that we have conscious minds. We know our own consciousness better than we know anything else. In fact, all of our knowledge of the world all around us is mediated to us through our senses and comes to us in our minds. So if the mind is not a real entity, then we don't have any knowledge at all, let alone scientific knowledge. Mind is the presupposed in all scientific inquiry, and getting rid of the mind as an explanatory entity is contrary to everything we actually know. We know from direct introspective activity better than we know anything else that we have minds. We also know from our introspective activity the causal powers that our minds have and what our minds can do. One of the things we know our minds can do is generate information. I'm doing that right now. So are you. So mind is a real entity. It is part of the world. It does really exist. And any good science will open itself up to all that takes place in the world. All the causes that are at work, including mental or conscious causes that are generated by minds. It's not just what exists in the material world that is real, because the mind is real, but it's immaterial. And it is very likely the best evidence that we have that the transcendental world, the spiritual world, the world of organized reality that is not material exists. The mind. And according to the Christian faith, the eternal mind, the mind of God, is the mind that everything else originates from. So, that's a rather lengthy and technical piece of video for you to munch over. If you have comments, questions, or prayer requests, you can leave them down below. There's also a link to this lesson down below. There's also a link to my Facebook page. You can communicate with me that way. And this is your old pal Papa Dale signing off for now and saying, use your mind. And I'm going to be praying for you that you'll be well, and I'm going to be praying for you that you'll be blessed. God bless you.